Good evening. Welcome to Teachers College. I'm delighted to be here to introduce my colleague, Professor Erin Pallas, our featured speaker tonight for the Endowed Professorship Lecture Series. This series is designed to offer our extraordinary faculty an opportunity to present their work and for you to learn more about the trailblazing research being conducted at TC in education, health, and psychology. And we're so grateful for our alumni and donors who support this work of the college, and we take pride in all they accomplish in their lives and careers. With this event, we continue a TC tradition of having a public lecture by a professor who has been awarded an endowed chair. Erin Pallas has been named the Arthur Gates Professor in Sociology and Education, so this is a great honor to have him speak to the TC community. Erin epitomizes the TC legacy of excellence and scholarship that's put into action for the greater good. His work, in particular on New York City schools, which you'll hear about this evening, is a prime example of how we need the best research in order to shape effective educational policy. Right now, the city school system is in a transitional phase. It remains to be seen the impact the new mayor and chancellor will have on New York City schools, the largest system in the country. What is clear and can be thoroughly analyzed is the type of school system Mayor de Blasio inherited from Michael Bloomberg. Few have studied Bloomberg's educational legacy as closely and with as much analytical skill as has Erin Pallas. This evening, Erin will explore how resources in the New York City public school system have been allocated during the 12-year Bloomberg administration. Although schools in large urban districts share a common mission, the resources on which they rely, namely dollars, good students, and experienced teachers, are in short supply. Erin will ask why some New York schools are consistent winners in the competition for resources while others are consistent losers. He will examine how resources were distributed, students were selected, and teachers were moved between schools, and how school district practices in New York City and elsewhere can amplify inequalities among schools and affect teaching, learning, and students' life courses. At a time when many urban school systems are looking at New York as a model, Erin sheds a critical light on what actually happened during the Bloomberg administration to city schools and what the implications may be for districts across the country, as well as the implications for policymakers and other stakeholders. Indeed, Erin has devoted his career to the question of what conditions are necessary to create better schools. To that end, he has examined the various ways in which schools sort students by neighborhood, language, and test scores, and how the sorting process affects them. Erin serves at TC as Professor of Sociology and Education in the Department of Education Policy and Social Analysis. He has taught at Johns Hopkins, Michigan State, and Northwestern, and has served as a statistician at the National Center for Educational Statistics in the U.S. Department of Education. He's a fellow of the American Educational Research Association and an elected member of the Sociological Research Association. It is now my great pleasure to introduce you to our new Arthur I. Gates Professor, Erin Pallas.
Thank you, Susan. It's a great honor to be speaking to you as the Arthur I. Gates Professor, following Phil Phoenix, Dorothy Strickland, and Clifford Hill in holding this chair. Nowadays, the name Gates conjures up different associations, but Arthur Gates was a professor and scholar of reading at Teachers College for 40 years, from 1917 to 1956. He served as president of the American Educational Research Association during World War II. A reading assessment he developed, the Gates-McGinnity reading tests, is still in use today. It's a great comfort to me that it's not a high-stakes assessment. I'd like to acknowledge some of the people who've come a long way to be here today. My brother Joe and sister-in-law Michelle, Penelope Peterson, the Eleanor R. Baldwin Professor and Dean of the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University, and Carl Alexander, John Dewey Professor and Chair of the Department of Sociology at the Johns Hopkins University, and his wife Kathy. There are a number of scholars here whose work in the sociology of education has inspired me, including Adam Gammeren, the president of the W.T. Grant Foundation, Julia Wrigley, interim executive vice chancellor and university provost at the City University of New York, Alan Sadovnik, Board of Governors Distinguished Service Professor at Rutgers University, Newark, and Floyd Hammock of NYU, to name just a few. I'm also grateful to see a number of my current and former students here, and would like to single out Jennifer Jennings, an assistant professor of sociology at New York University, and TC doctoral students Claire Flack and Barbara Tanner, with whom I've collaborated on the research that I'll be talking about tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the financial support of the Ford Foundation and the Spencer Foundation. This talk is about inequality in resource allocations among New York City's public schools. I'm going to consider three different kinds of school resources: teachers, dollars, and students. And I'm going to suggest that different mechanisms govern how these three types of resources are distributed among New York City schools. I'm going to argue that inequality in the distribution of teachers can be characterized as a vicious circle, that inequality in the distribution of dollars can be described as path dependence, and that inequalities in the distribution of students can be described as neglect. Although social scientists are always eager to understand who gets what and why, the stakes here are more than just academic, because school resources shape students' opportunities to learn. Students are better off if they attend schools with a stable, experienced teaching force, schools that have sufficient funding to provide for students' academic and social needs, and schools that are not overwhelmed by an excessive concentration of students with high needs. To set the stage, let me say a bit about the organization of New York City's public school system over the past dozen years, an era marked by the mayoral administration of Michael Bloomberg and the leadership of schools chancellor Joel Klein. Over this period, the system adopted the metaphor of a stock portfolio as a management model. A stockbroker looks at the stocks in a portfolio and sells off the low performers, buying more of the high performers. A balanced portfolio spreads the risk so that not all of one's eggs are placed in a single basket. New York City tried to diversify its portfolio of schools, supporting the expansion of the charter sector by providing public space at no cost for many charter schools, and creating a school accountability system in which schools performing well were intended to be rewarded, and schools performing poorly were intended to be closed. This shift in the organization of the system was captured in a widely quoted turn of phrase in which Joel Klein said that he wanted New York City to go from being a great school system to a system of great schools. This shift focused attention on individual school buildings competing with one another for resources, and the development of a set of policies and practices that would enable schools and school leaders to have more autonomy and more control over their internal operations in exchange for heightened accountability for the student outcomes they were charged with producing. I'm not going to suggest that the district's shift toward policies relying on the invisible hand of the market is necessarily the source of the inequalities we're talking about. I am, however, going to suggest that they didn't do anything to undo these inequalities. The first inequality I want to talk about is inequalities among schools in the retention of good, experienced teachers. In urban school systems like New York's, as many as 50% of the teachers who are new to their buildings will leave within the first 3 years. Teacher turnover is a policy issue because students learn more in schools with lower turnover, and it's expensive to recruit and replace teachers when they leave. Some schools do a better job of hanging on to their teachers than do others. 4 years ago, I surveyed more than 4,000 middle school teachers in New York City, spread across 125 different middle schools. I asked these teachers whether, during that school year, they had thought about leaving their school or leaving teaching altogether. 1/3 of them reported that they'd thought about leaving their school, and 23% had thought about leaving teaching altogether. All told, 39% had thought about leaving their position as a teacher in their current classroom, in their current school. Now, not everyone who thinks about leaving actually does. If they did, most schools would be empty. But the schools in which more teachers thought about leaving did have higher actual turnover rates than schools in which fewer teachers thought about leaving. The teachers in some schools were much less likely to report that they thought about leaving than the teaching in other schools. This slide shows that there were some schools where as many as 3/4 of the teachers had thought about leaving, and others where as few as 15 to 20% of the teachers had thought about leaving. Why is this? One reason is that the attributes of schools shape teachers' view of the school as a place to work. In this next slide, I look at the total enrollment of the 125 middle schools in the study and divide them up into 4 quartiles ranging from low enrollment to high enrollment. We can see that the teachers in the smallest schools are actually quite a bit more likely to think about leaving than the teachers in the schools in the top quartile, which may seem a little counterintuitive given all of the buzz about small schools. On the right side of the slide, I show that fewer than 30% of the teachers in schools that have less than 70% Black and Hispanic students report thinking about leaving their classrooms, whereas about 1/2 of the teachers in schools that are 95% or more Black and Hispanic think about leaving. Not surprisingly, there are other structural characteristics of middle schools that are correlated with size and racial ethnic composition, and we would see similar patterns for these. In addition to school demography, though, the personal characteristics of teachers also affect whether they think about leaving. How a teacher entered the teaching force matters a lot, with teachers who came through alternate routes, such as the New York City Teaching Fellows or Teach for America, being much more likely to have considered leaving either their school or leaving teaching altogether than teachers who were prepared through traditional routes. Teachers' personal characteristics, such as their marital status, matters as well. Teachers who had never married or had a domestic partner were more likely to report that they had considered leaving than teachers who are married, divorced, separated, or widowed. It may be that there are more risks associated with leaving one's position for teachers who have families to support and sustain. The rhythms of teachers' lives may be more influential in shaping their decision-making than public policy appreciates. Commuting time, for example, is a reliable predictor of thinking about leaving one's current school, but not leaving teaching altogether. It can be difficult to disentangle the influence of school demography and teachers' personal characteristics on thinking about leaving because teachers are not randomly matched with schools. We see, for example, that alternate route teachers are much more likely to be placed in high-need schools that are smaller and serve higher concentrations of Black and Hispanic students. More than 40% of the teachers in the smallest quartile of schools are alternate route teachers, whereas fewer than 20% of the teachers in the largest quartile of schools entered teaching through an alternate route. And in schools with fewer than 70% Black and Hispanic students, only about 16% of the teachers are alternate route teachers, compared to more than 30% of the teachers in schools that are 95% Black and Hispanic. So far, we've looked at school demography and a couple of teachers' personal characteristics. What about how the school is organized? Terms such as school climate or school culture are used to describe the ways in which a school functions. We asked teachers to tell us whether they thought the school had a supportive, effective principal, whether teachers supported one another and shared a collective responsibility for student learning, whether the school was orderly or marked by student disorder, and whether there was a culture of efficacy in the school, among other features of school organization. There's pretty clear evidence that teachers are less likely to think about leaving their classroom if they think that their school is functioning well. This slide shows this for 2 school attributes, principal leadership and school disorder. Among teachers in the schools in the top quartile of supportive and effective principal leadership, about 30% report considering leaving. But in schools in the lowest quartile of principal leadership, half of the teachers reported thinking about leaving their classrooms. On the right side of the slide, we see a similar pattern when we divide schools into quartiles based on teachers' reports of the extent of school disorder. We see that teachers in schools with high levels of disorder are more likely to think about leaving than teachers in schools with lower levels of disorder. These associations between school functioning and teachers' thoughts of leaving are observed even if we take account of school demography. So here's a key part of the mechanism generating inequality in the distribution of teachers. Schools differ in their organization, and teachers are more likely to think about leaving poorly functioning schools than those that are functioning well. But it turns out that the converse is also true. Schools that have lost teachers are also less likely to be functioning well than schools that have retained most of their teachers. Instead of thinking of school organization as a predictor of teachers' thoughts of leaving, I looked at school organization as an outcome predicted from actual rates of teacher turnover in the 125 middle schools over the 3 years preceding the survey. This next slide shows how the quality of principal leadership and the extent of school disorder vary by a school's turnover rate over and above the effects of school demography and individual teacher attributes on school organization. On the left side of the slide, we see that principal leadership is significantly higher in the schools in the lowest quartile of prior teacher turnover and lower in the quartiles with higher turnover. On the right side, we see that school disorder is lower in schools with lower levels of teacher turnover and higher in schools with higher levels of turnover. This then is the vicious circle. Teachers are sorted in a non-random way into schools that differ in their demography. School demography shapes whether a school is organized in an effective way. Teachers think about leaving schools that are not organized effectively. And when they do leave, the quality of the school's organization declines. Okay, maybe it's not a circle. But vicious still works pretty well as a description. Now I'm going to talk about inequalities in school spending. I want to draw on the imagery that was prevalent in our new mayor, Bill de Blasio's election campaign. He talked about a tale of two cities. I'm talking about a tale of two schools. Here's a map of the city of New York, divided into the 5 boroughs: Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Manhattan. And I'd like to draw your attention to 2 schools in the Bronx, PS 97 and PS 68. They're fewer than 3 miles apart, and they serve a similar mix of students. This slide shows the location of these 2 schools relative to citywide averages for student demography. The bars for each school show how far away it is from the citywide average of elementary and middle schools in standard deviation units. For the most part, PS 97 and PS 68 are similar in their racial and ethnic composition, the percentage of students who are eligible for a free or reduced price lunch, the percentage of students who are new to learning English or in self-contained or integrated special education classrooms. It's true that PS 68 is predominantly black and has a lower concentration of Latino students than PS 97, but there's no reason to think that that would affect the respective funding levels of the schools. These 2 schools are similar in some other respects as well. They have similar concentrations of low-achieving students, are roughly the same size, and have approximately the same percentages of teachers who hold a master's degree or higher. And they're not hugely different in terms of the percentage of teachers with 3 or fewer years of experience. PS 97 has fewer of these teachers, fewer of these inexperienced teachers who might have lower salaries and thus cost less. So we might expect that its expenditures would actually be a bit higher than those in the other school, PS 68. But on balance, these 2 schools look pretty similar, and they're pretty close to one another in the Bronx. But their spending patterns are dramatically different. We see on the slide that PS 68 spends a full standard deviation more per pupil than the citywide average, about $2,800 per pupil. And PS 97 spends about half a standard deviation less per pupil, about $1,400 less than the citywide average. All told, PS 68 is spending $4,200 more per pupil than PS 97, even though they're 3 miles apart and serve similar populations of students. How can we explain this? New York City is one of just a few school districts that report building-level school expenditures for traditional public schools, not just a school's budget, but how much a school actually spent, what the money was spent on, and where the money came from. I'm interested in spending on instruction, which includes classroom instruction, instructional support services, and leadership and supervision. I added up the total amount spent on these functions in the school, and divided by the number of students to get an instructional per pupil expenditure. There are two main sources of funds that go to schools: state and local taxes on the one hand, and federal and state grants on the other. The funds are blended, so a school gets a budget that is a mixture of tax money and grant money. But the grant money typically has strings attached. It can be used for some purposes, but not others. And when a teacher or other school employee is paid for from tax money, the school system pays for fringe benefits such as insurance or pension contributions. But when a staff member is paid from grant money, the school has to pay for fringe benefits for that worker from its own budget. What this means is that a grant dollar going to hire someone is worth less than a tax dollar being used for that purpose. About 3/4 of all instructional expenditures at the school building level come from tax funds, and 1/4 from grant funds. We can see that PS 68 and PS 97 are getting similar amounts of grant money per pupil, but PS 68 is getting $4,000 more per pupil than PS 97 in tax money. Some years ago, Jennifer Jennings and I tried to make sense of these kinds of expenditure differences across the city's elementary and middle schools using the data available to us, which only went through 2005. This was before New York City instituted a new initiative in 2007 that was intended to redistribute funding among schools in a fairer way. New York City called its plan Fair Student Funding, but it's more generally known as weighted student funding. The idea is that each year, an allocation goes to a school based on the configuration of the students who are attending the school and their needs, rather than on other criteria, such as last year's allocation or the number of staff members in the school and their salaries. Some students have academic and social needs that cost more to serve, and students who are identified with such needs bring with them to the school an allocation that is weighted to account for those extra costs. The slide shows the metaphor of a child with a backpack with dollars that follow him or her to the school. So for example, educating a child in a self-contained special education classroom is far more costly than educating a general education student, and therefore a school gets an extra allocation for each special education student in a self-contained classroom on its register. Fair student funding is intended to result in a fairer allocation of the city's resources, so that each school would get an allocation that was adequate to support the education of the students in that school and their distinctive mix of academic and social needs. Some New York City principals will tell you that fair student funding has never really been implemented. The funding formula had to be tinkered with so that schools would not be punished for having a concentration of more experienced and hence more costly teachers on staff when the plan got started in 2007. And New York City never received the billions of dollars that the highest court in the state ruled that it was entitled to in the Campaign for Fiscal Equity case. So schools are generally receiving about 85% of what the fair student funding formula says they should receive. But whether fair student funding was ever implemented as intended, I'm here to tell you that nothing has changed. The pattern of unequal funding that Jennifer and I observed from 2000 to 2005 persists today. I'm going to show you this in a minute. This is blank for a reason. So you look at me instead of that cute little kid. But before I do, I need to remind you of another important change in the governance of New York City's schools, for which I don't have a slide, which is why you're looking at me. When the state legislature gave control of the schools to Mayor Bloomberg in 2002, the balance of power shifted in fundamental ways. From 1968 to 2002, New York City was divided up into 32 community school districts, each with an elected school board, which appointed a district superintendent. The district superintendents were responsible for the elementary and middle schools in the district. When Mayor Bloomberg was granted control of the Department of Education, he abolished the 32 community school boards and stripped the community superintendents of most of their responsibilities. Now, the community school districts are larger than neighborhoods, but they do represent 32 contiguous areas throughout the 5 boroughs of the city. And because of residential segregation, and New York City is highly segregated, some community school districts are the home to children and youth with greater academic needs than those in other districts. It's not out of the question, therefore, that spending levels would be higher in some community school districts than in others, due to differences across districts in the mix of students attending the schools in a given district. That's, in fact, what this next slide shows. These pie charts, or if you prefer, Pac-Man charts, show that there's variation in average per pupil spending across the 32 community school districts for total expenditures, tax money expenditures, and especially grant money expenditures. The community school districts are labeled CSDs on the slide. The typical elementary or middle school is about $2,800 away from the citywide average in total per pupil instructional spending. The typical community school district is about $1,200 away from the average of all 32 community school districts in total spending. If we divide up all the variation in total per pupil spending among elementary and middle schools across the city, 19% of that variation is due to differences in average spending across the 32 community school districts. 12% of the variation in tax money spending is between districts, and 28% of the variance in grant money spending is due to the fact that some of the 32 community school districts spend more with grant money than do others. Now, we do expect that schools serving students with higher needs, students in poverty, English language learners, students with disabilities, and low-achieving students will spend more per pupil, and that expectation is built into the Fair Student Funding formula. And schools that have highly experienced and highly credentialed teaching forces may spend more also, because teachers' salaries are higher when teachers are more experienced and have more advanced educational credentials. So it's at least possible that some of the school-to-school variation in spending patterns is due to the characteristics of the students and the characteristics of the teachers in those schools. This next slide looks at how much of the variation across districts and across schools can be attributed to student and teacher characteristics. The second row of pie slices shows what happened when I statistically adjusted per pupil spending for differences in student-teacher characteristics across districts. It takes the amount of between-district variation in the first row and divides it up into the amount that can be explained by student and teacher characteristics, the bright red, and the amount that remains unexplained, the pink. What this row indicates is that most of the variation in spending across the 32 community school districts can be explained by the fact that each district has a different mix of students and teachers. The third row does the same thing, here focusing on the differences in spending from one school to the next. And here, the bright blue represents the portion of that variation that can be attributed to school differences in student and teacher characteristics. The light blue represents the amount of variation that is still unexplained after we take these factors into account. And what we see is there's still a lot of variation in spending across schools that is unexplained by student and teacher characteristics. We can explain about 2/3 of the variation in per pupil expenditures as a function of the mix of student and teacher characteristics, but we can't explain the rest. Even with these adjustments, two schools with similar students and similar teachers are likely to differ by about $1,500 per pupil in their total instructional spending. Now, these adjustments that I've made aren't precise. For teachers, I'm obliged to use the percentage of teachers in a school with a master's degree and the percentage of teachers with 3 or fewer years of experience, because those are the data that the state reports. Still, it's unlikely that more precise measures of teachers and their salaries would eliminate these differences across schools. So we may not be doing very well at explaining these differences across schools and spending patterns if we can only explain 2/3 of the variation. But the differences are pretty stable from one year to the next. This next slide shows that the total per pupil expenditures in the 2010-2011 school year are correlated 0.90 with expenditures in the preceding school year. It's a very high correlation from one year to the next. In fact, spending patterns are surprisingly stable from one decade to the next. For those schools that were in existence both in 1999-2000 and the 2010-2011 school year, 11 years apart, the correlation in per pupil instructional spending is 0.50. Again, maybe not a huge surprise. Neighborhood demography might change slowly, so that schools that are serving more high-need students in 1999 may be the same ones that are serving more high-need students in 2010. But should funding levels in 1999 affect spending in 2010 once we've taken account of the characteristics of a school's teachers and students in 2010? Remarkably, there's a substantial effect of 1999 per pupil spending on 2010 spending over and above the effects of the characteristics of students and teachers in 2010. A school that was above average in spending in 1999, say 1 standard deviation above the mean, spent an additional $409 per pupil in 2010 than another school that had similar students and teachers in 2010. Since an average elementary and middle school in New York City has about 720 students, that means that a school that was above average in 1999 in its spending has about an extra $300,000 in its budget in 2010 compared to a similar school, similar students and teachers in 2010, that was at the average level of spending in 1999. The term that Jennifer and I use to describe this pattern is path dependence. Path dependence is the idea that the timing and sequencing of events in a social or political process constrains the trajectory of subsequent events. Once a government agency has started down a track, the costs of reversal can be very high. There will always be new choice points, and allocation patterns inevitably will evolve, but entrenched institutional arrangements make it hard to undo some of those initial choices. It's kind of maddening that we can't observe what those initial choices are. We know there's variation at the beginning of our period, 1999. We don't really know why. But it's likely that two things are entrenched in these allocation rules, and therefore difficult to undo. One is the provisions of the collective bargaining agreements between the city and the teachers union. The second is the strings that are attached to funds that originate at higher levels of government, such as the state and the federal government. But we also have to wonder to what extent sheer politics affected the unequal distribution of resources as far back as 1999. So this is the epitome of what I'm calling enigmatic inequality. We see unexplained variation in spending patterns among schools today, and we know that it's related to inequalities in previous years, but we don't really know where the inequality came from in the first place. The third inequality I want to talk about concerns over-the-counter high school students. The term over-the-counter, which has been in use at least since the 1970s, refers to students who do not enter New York City high schools via the high school choice process that takes place in 8th grade. Instead, over-the-counter students show up unexpectedly at a school seeking admission. They might be recent immigrants or students who moved into New York City from other areas. Nowadays, 8th graders rank up to 12 high school programs they wish to consider, and a computer algorithm matches them with a single high school based on how students rank schools and schools rank the students that apply to them. It's the same algorithm that's used for matching medical residents to medical residency programs. A student entering high school via the matching process is known as a list notice student. Any other first-time admission to a New York City high school is classified as an over-the-counter admission. Even if we restrict our field of view to comprehensive high schools, omitting the citywide special education schools of District 75, the alternative schools of District 79, and the 9 selective exam high schools such as Stuyvesant or LaGuardia, there are about 300,000 high school students who have been admitted over the counter over the last 13 years. In a given year, anywhere between 20 and 30% of the students who are entering New York City high schools for the first time are being admitted over the counter. Historically, over-the-counter students have struggled academically. I looked at the performance of over-the-counter high school students compared to other high school students as far back as I could go with data graciously provided by the Department of Education. First, I looked at attendance and credit accumulation, focusing on the year after a student was admitted to high school for the first time, when both a new over-the-counter student and the school have had a little bit of time to adjust to one another. In this next slide, you can see that over-the-counter students, labeled OTC for short, admitted in the 2002-2003 school year had an attendance rate the following year, that is in their second year of high school, of about 77%, compared to about 84% for non-over-the-counter students. That attendance differential has shrunk steadily over time, but there's still about a 1.5% to 2% gap for over-the-counter students entering in 2011-2012, the most recent year for which we have a subsequent year of attendance data. We see essentially the same pattern for the high school credits accumulated by over-the-counter students in their second year of high school. Over-the-counter students were much less likely to earn 10 or more credits in their second year of high school than other high school students at the beginning of last decade, roughly 47% of over-the-counter students compared to 57% of other high school students. But that gap closed as well, and since 2007, roughly the same percentage of over-the-counter students and other students have been earning 10 or more credits in their second year of high school. Finally, I want to show you graduation rates for over-the-counter high school students compared to other students, using the last discharge code recorded in the Department of Education's files for each student. I'm distinguishing among three different types of diplomas: a local diploma represented in pink, a Regents diploma shown in blue, and an advanced Regents diploma displayed in green. For both over-the-counter students and other students, graduation rates have risen sharply over time, which is good news. And with the phasing out of the less rigorous local diploma, more and more students are graduating with a Regents diploma. Still, over-the-counter students are less likely to graduate from high school than other students, though the gap has shrunk, and many, many entrants to New York City's high schools never graduate at all. Schools cannot be said to choose to admit over-the-counter students. For the most part, these are students who are thrust upon them. And in the early years of the data that I'm showing you, it's clear that over-the-counter high school students were more likely to be struggling academically than other new students. Later, attendance rates, credit accumulation, and graduation rates would figure heavily in the school progress reports devised by the Department of Education as a basis for grading schools and judging which ones to close for low performance. Were new over-the-counter high school students distributed fairly across the comprehensive high schools in New York City? Or did some high schools get more than their fair share and others less? Put differently, were over-the-counter students segregated from other students in the way that we talk about minority students being segregated from white students? A common measure of student segregation is the index of dissimilarity, which ranges from 0 to 1. Suppose that we have 4 schools in a school system, all the same size, and the school system is 75% minority and 25% white. If each of the 4 schools also is 75% minority and 25% white, then there is no segregation of students by race, and the index of dissimilarity is 0. On the other hand, if 3 of the 4 schools are 100% minority and the 4th is 100% white, then there is segregation, and the index of dissimilarity takes on the value of 1.0. The value can be interpreted as the fraction of students in a group who would have to change schools in order to be distributed across schools proportional to their representation in the population. Finally, let's look at the case where there's some segregation. Overall, the system is 25% white, but the first school is 40% white, second school is 30% white, school 3 is 20% white, school 4 is 10% white. In this case, the index of dissimilarity is 0.27, indicating that 27% of students would have to change schools in order to be evenly distributed across all the schools in this system. And that's about the level of segregation of over-the-counter students that we see across comprehensive high schools in New York City, a value of around 0.30, which means that 30% of over-the-counter students would have to change schools in order for these students to be distributed evenly across high schools. And when I began this project, I was pretty sure of what I would find. The portfolio management approach that evolved in New York City resulted in the creation of hundreds of new small high schools, along with the closing of a few dozen large comprehensive high schools. I was convinced that the system's managers were trying to buffer the new small schools from taking their fair share of the more challenging over-the-counter students in an effort to maximize the likelihood that these new small schools would succeed according to the system's new accountability criteria. Over-the-counter students, because they did have lower attendance rates, lower rates of credit accumulation, and lower graduation rates, were going to make a school look less successful. So if the system was basically pushing these over-the-counter students into some schools and not others, there was a sense in which the system had put its thumb on the scale, systematically setting some schools up to fail and others not to fail. And I thought it was the new small schools that were being protected. It was an appealing story, but it's not quite right. It wasn't that new small schools were being buffered from over-the-counter students. They were taking in approximately the same percentage of over-the-counter students as the already existing schools. Now, it is true that some of these new small high schools were members of the Internationals Network for Public Schools, a highly regarded group of schools designed specifically for relatively recent immigrants to the US who are not proficient in English. And the international high schools do enroll quite a few over-the-counter students. But instead, the story seems to be that schools that were closing over time had higher concentrations of over-the-counter students for several years before they closed. So this slide shows schools that closed between 2001 and 2008, showing the percentage of students who were admitted over-the-counter in those schools compared to other schools. There's no question that the schools that were closing over that period had much higher rates of over-the-counter admissions than other comprehensive high schools. But it wasn't systematically the case that new small schools were the ones that were being protected. The story here is more one of plunking over-the-counter students into schools that were on a trajectory for school closure years before they enrolled their final entering class of students. And as much as I might have wanted to blame this on the Bloomberg and Klein administration, the pattern was already in place by the time that Mayor Bloomberg took office. This next slide shows that just those schools that closed in 2007 and 2008, enrolling their final entering classes. And you can see that these schools were already taking in more than their fair share of over-the-counter students as far back as 1999, 3 years before Mayor Bloomberg gained control of the schools. The pattern simply persisted over a long period of time until eventually the district said, these schools are failing at a level that warrants closure. So while the Department of Education didn't create this pattern, it really didn't do anything to disrupt the pattern. The term I'm using to describe this kind of inequality among schools is neglect. I'll quote here from Robert Louis Stevenson. Perpetual devotion toward what a man calls his business is only to be sustained by perpetual neglect of many other things. One of the things that was neglected over the last 15 years was the distribution of over-the-counter students among schools and how these students fared in the system. Thankfully, that's no longer the case. A recent report by Norm Fruchter on behalf of the Annenberg Institute for School Reform has revived attention to over-the-counter students. And over-the-counter students are not doing as poorly academically as they used to, which may mean that the schools that they are enrolling in now are doing a better job of meeting their academic and social needs than the schools they were entering a decade ago. I've described three mechanisms of inequality: the vicious circle, path dependence, and neglect. How do we break the cycle? Let's not kid ourselves. It won't be easy. I'm not the first person to identify the distribution of teachers, dollars, and students as a policy problem. And I'm aware of the different values that are in tension in our city in general and in the school system in particular. We value fairness, but not at the expense of efficiency. We value equity, but not at the expense of efficiency. And we want to maximize choice in our lives, even if that choice consists of buying a 32-ounce sugary soft drink. But as Mike Bloomberg argued, allowing the choice of buying a large sugary soft drink increased consumers' risk of diabetes, obesity, and other ailments. And the cost of treatment, potentially unnecessary if people didn't consume so much sugar, often had to be borne by the city, which compromised efficiency. These values tensions are inscribed in how we've organized our school system. Some policies and practices are long-standing, whereas others are more recent. There's a strong presumption, for example, that teachers should get to choose where they teach, and they build their lives and their careers around that presumption. The moves toward a market-based model of decentralization in New York City, in theory, gives principals control over hiring and spending, that is, allowing them to choose their teachers and other staff in exchange for being accountable for results. But these choice mechanisms for teachers and principals have resulted in a substantial number of teachers in the absent teacher reserve on the New York City payroll, but without full-time teaching assignments, which arguably is inefficient. Teacher turnover, unequal spending, and inequitable placements of high-need students all can be viewed as forms of instability in the New York City school system. And therefore, I'm going to talk at the end here now about some policy strategies for stabilizing the flow of resources. In acknowledging that schools that lack a stable, competent, and experienced teaching force are not doing well by their students, we recognize that schools do a better job of hanging on to teachers when teachers perceive their principal to be a supportive leader and when they perceive the school to be organized in an effective way. Therefore, we may seek to do a better job of developing school principals. One consequence of the opening of hundreds of new schools in New York City is that there are many, many principals now at the helm of New York City schools who have limited experience in their buildings, or in any school for that matter. 65% of the principals of the 421 schools, high schools receiving a progress report grade in 2012 had a principal with fewer than 5 years of experience leading their school. It's hard to see how new and inexperienced principals are going to be successful in providing the kind of supportive school organization that can retain good teachers without a system-wide commitment to professional development of principals. And this needs to go beyond what the department has invested in the New York City Leadership's Academy Aspiring Principals program. We already see signs that new Chancellor Carmen Farina is moving to make experience more central to the selection of school principals by requiring 7 years of experience as an educator in the system to be eligible to be hired as a principal, including a minimum of 5 years of experience as a K-12 teacher. Schools may also be more successful in creating a supportive and effective school organization if they're able to cobble together a critical mass of educators. A skilled principal and a core of experienced teachers can work together to begin the process of building an effective school organization in a school that isn't functioning well. This is the idea behind strategic staffing initiatives, which typically identify a team involving a principal and some teachers and provide financial incentives for team members to move from their current schools and to remain in the new setting for some minimum time. There typically is less stigma associated with a strategic staffing team than with some of the more draconian school turnaround models touted by the U.S. Department of Education, which may require that many, many more staff members be replaced at once. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg, North Carolina School District is the poster child for strategic staffing, but that district already is worried that scaling up the initiative beyond the 20 schools in which it's been implemented requires a deeper pool of skilled school leaders than the district currently has. With regard to the distribution of resources, we need to acknowledge that some, but probably not all, of the inequalities that we observe in per-pupil spending may be there for good reason. The bigger problem is that over the last decade, the system hasn't received the funds that it needs and deserves to provide adequate instructional dollars to schools. Albany has never honored the state Supreme Court's decision in the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit, and New York City has been shortchanged by billions of dollars. If the city were to receive the money that it's owed, it's possible that schools that are underfunded could be leveled up in ways that would make funding more equitable. We have the potential in the new mayoral administration for a more aggressive lobbying campaign for the monies that the city is owed than we saw under Mike Bloomberg. But Mayor de Blasio is focusing his efforts on gaining statewide support for his universal pre-K initiative, and other issues, understandably, are taking a back seat. My colleague Michael Rebell is leading a new effort to try to compel the state legislature to come forward with the money that the highest court in the state has decided that New York City is due. There's a longstanding debate about the effects of school spending on student outcomes. But one issue on which all parties agree is that money can be squandered or spent wisely, and how money is spent matters. The ways in which funds are allocated to schools may be as destabilizing as the total amount of dollars spent at the end of the year. One of the challenges that principals face is that money does come with strings and sometimes arrives or disappears at unpredictable times. For example, if a school doesn't meet its projected registered target, money that a principal may have already committed to spending on behalf of students gets taken away overnight. And all of a sudden, the school is in debt to the system. And for some reason, that image, a principal owing the system money for reasons outside of his or her control, always reminds me of The Sopranos. I'm not sure why. So one strategy for enhancing system stability, in addition to just trying to get more money into buildings, is to build more slack resources into the budgeting system so that principals have more capacity to make adjustments based on short-term fluctuations in what they identify as their building's needs. Finally, with regard to over-the-counter students, there still is an ongoing concern that some schools in New York City's elaborate high school choice process give more than their fair share of high-need students, of which over-the-counter students are just one type. And the choice system imposes no system-wide constraints on which students get matched to which schools. That approach historically has resulted in many students getting one of their top choices, maximizing choice as a value, but in a way that can result in some schools having a higher concentration of high-need students than they really should have. And we know from lots of research that having a high concentration of high-need students in a school makes it more likely that that school will fail. Oops. So placing some caps in the choice system so that no school gets an undue concentration of high-need students, whether over-the-counter or otherwise, is a desirable tweak to the system, even if it results in a smaller percentage of students getting one of their top choices. It's simply not fair to students to be enrolled in high schools that are teeming with high-need students. Now, the data that I presented suggests that the problem of over-the-counter students may be resolving itself. The diversified portfolio management of New York City's high schools may already be steering over-the-counter students into schools that are better prepared to serve them. However, it may also be worthwhile to think about creating some transitional schools for over-the-counter students who arrive in the middle of the semester, so that students are not suddenly thrust into a school and into classrooms that have already developed routines. Perhaps borough-wide transitional schools for over-the-counter students could serve as a bridge for these students before they're admitted to a regular New York City high school at the beginning of the semester. What's the solution to enigmatic inequality in New York City's public schools? I'm arguing that building the capacity to stabilize the system is central. But stability is not a synonym for inertia or inaction. nor is it a justification for the status quo. Think of stability as a necessary condition for thoughtful, planned reductions in enigmatic inequality in New York City's public schools. Let me invite you to consider this concluding idea. Enhancing system stability can support a great school system. Thank you.
While you and I don't always agree on policy matters, I always know that your research is honest and that when the findings are counter-indicative of where you'd like to see them go, you're the first to admit that. So I do appreciate it, and particularly appreciate your recommendations. They're very solid, and I think if implemented would result in a much stronger school system. I want to first clear up the mystery around the funding inequities among schools that go back to '99 and earlier. And my experience in the school system at that time tells me, as a principal and in other positions, leads me to believe that the funding inequities grew out of the fact that superintendents from '68 to 2002 had the opportunity to reward the principals who supported them, who they liked, who they had relationships with, and punish those that they didn't. And that resulted in a basic system of funding inequities to start with. The reason I think fair student funding never adequately addressed it is it was really only in effect for 2 years because with the economic crash of 2008, it pretty much went out the window, and the priority for funding was to not lay off teachers, which the mayor committed to. Around the over-the-counters, there's a complex dance, and that is the schools that fill up first because of the choice system are the more desirable schools. Therefore, the schools that have seats for over-the-counter students are the less desirable schools, the schools that are poorer performing. The only way to address that issue adequately would be to reserve seats in every school for over-the-counter students. But politically, it's very hard to say to a parent today that your child can't attend this school because we're saving the seat for a student who isn't in New York at the moment. Mm-hmm. So that becomes complicated. Last thing I want to point out, which none of us have spoken about publicly, nor has the profession addressed adequately. We understand that at this point in the 21st century, young people are likely to have 6 or 7 different jobs, if not different careers, and we accept that about life in the 21st century in all areas except education. And what we haven't done yet is figure out what that likely instability, what impact that likely instability will have, and how we need to adjust in terms of a changing reality where people simply aren't going to go into teaching for 20, 30 years, as you and I might have, did in fact, but are likely to stay in for a much shorter period of time and then move on and do something else. What are the implications for human resource strategies? And what are the implications for how we think about delivering instruction to children if, in fact, there's going to be this kind of constant turnover, impacting not just education, but all professions and activities in the society? I want to thank you again. It was a terrific lecture.
Thanks.
I wanted to thank you, first of all, for this really comprehensive view of the inequity problem that I've been wrestling with for years from what one might say is a more narrow perspective. So having this expansive view is very useful. But one interesting little fact I wanted to mention about the CFE case, which I litigated for many years, is that in addition to the fact that the state hasn't provided all the money that was promised under the CFE settlements, it also has acted unconstitutionally in the very pattern that you're talking about. Because a little known aspect of the CFE case is that the Court of Appeals, the highest court, specified that every school, not just the district as a whole, but every school in New York City was entitled to the actual amount of resources it needed to provide a sound basic education. And nobody's picked up on that in looking at the distribution of funding as you so well have.
Alan Sadovnik, Rutgers University. As you know, I've been studying education in Newark for almost as long as you've been studying education in New York City. And what's perhaps ironic with your talk is that as Mayor de Blasio takes office and Joel Klein's impact seems to now be reduced and perhaps moving back away from it, his influence in Newark keeps growing. That is, as many of you know, his protege, Cami Anderson, has done almost everything you've talked about in portfolio of schools in Newark in barely 3 years. And most recently, you talked about the reserve pool. She's gone to the state asking them for a waiver to fire 700 reserve pool teachers without due process and to replace them with 500 Teach for America corps members to teach special education, that is, teachers with no experience going into the most difficult and challenging schools, teaching the most challenging students. So my question to you is based upon your study, over both Bloomberg and Klein's tenure, based upon this portfolio model, school closures, the whole expansion of everything is going on in Newark. What lessons might you offer to Superintendent Anderson as she's so confident that the Klein way is the way to go in a place like Newark?
As many of you in the room know, I've not been a silent critic of the reforms that New York City's public schools experienced over the Bloomberg and Klein years. Having said that, it is hard to summarize their impact, and there are certainly many things that they did that I think were very good, and others perhaps less so. I do think it's fair to say that there were things that were destabilizing for the people who work in schools, for children, for teachers, and for principals, but other things that were stabilizing forces. And I'm a big fan of stabilization. I really do think that stabilization is central to enhancing school systems. It's much easier to figure out how to organize if you have predictable flows of resources. And that's really the sort of the crux of the talk that I'm giving tonight, is about the unpredictable and unequal flows of resources that schools are getting. So my advice to Ms. Anderson is to think about the impact that on predictability and the flows of resources to individual school buildings based on the policies that she's entertaining. Doesn't mean that if she were to do that, that she would change what she's doing, because she is, I think, many school leaders draw on their experience and become true believers in the approaches that they're championing. But that's what I would recommend.
My question is about one of your recommendations. You recommended transitional programs. And I guess I was wondering where you came up with this idea and what it was based on. Do you have data that shows that these programs have been successful in New York City or other schools? Because my impression of transitional programs have been sort of negative. They've sort of had some, there's been a reputation for them keeping students in transitional programs too long. So I was wondering where you came up with that idea.
Honestly, it's an idea that came out of conversations with some union leaders. And it's intended specifically to be bounded so that the time in a transitional setting is solely until the beginning of the next semester.
Okay.
And it's, again, an effort to try to stabilize the workings of schools, because classrooms are very disrupted when new students show up unexpectedly in the middle of a term. Now, it may well be that the internationals high schools, certainly for recent immigrants, are just a better setting overall for newcomers who are recent immigrants than a borough-level transitional center might be. But there are too many newcomers to go around to really be adequately served, I think.
Right. Okay. Then I guess, just to play devil's advocate, if union representatives were the ones who were kind of, I guess, presenting this idea to you, I guess, what would the teachers who are teaching in the transitional programs do once those students leave? Would they be out of a job? I think there's a lot of questions about, you create a program such as a transitional program, then how do you staff those programs with really good teachers who are going to be there for a while, And,
No,
there's a lot of,
yeah.
I think there's just, a lot to consider when recommending something like that, and I'm just sort of bringing that up because I think it's important to consider that when you make such a recommendation.
That's an excellent point. I would be unhappy if a borough transitional center were to be a warehouse
Right.
for kids. That's not good for kids. And it would require recruiting teachers who were prepared to work intensively with students for a short period of time and then recognize the students are going to move on. We already have alternative school settings that are intended to do that. So I think that it's possible to design schools that could do that effectively.
My name is Samson Pena. Sorry. And I am a guidance counselor at International High School. That is part of that network. And all year round, we get over-the-counter students. And the way we've learned is through professional development and to understand the curriculum that we provide to our students. And it does disrupt the process when you have students coming in January, February, March, which happens, but we've gotten better over time with that. And with teachers that are coming in, they understand that that's part of the process. And that's at the conversation at the beginning when the hiring is happening. So I think we have a lot of success, and there's still a lot of schools that need to take into account those type of students and to have professional developments for teachers in traditional high schools to cater to those students. But I do think that the system is getting better at distributing those type of students with schools that can actually serve those students. So,
Thank you. I think international high schools clearly are doing a better job, and they are organized specifically to address the needs of these students who are in and out.
yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Floyd Hammock here. Aaron, do you know the history of the word or the term over-the-counter?
No, you know what? I went back and found a reference in the New York Times from 1978, but that's as far as I could do.
I just am interested in the origin of that term because it does have, again, market connotations. Are these kids like over-the-counter stocks? Or, and I've heard this, is that it's also like over the transom, which is a phrase that publishers use about manuscripts that they don't know are going to be offered to them.
Yeah,
And
I
the
think
transom being the window over the door that people would throw their...
I think it was literally over the counter in a
Right.
school principal's office,
Right.
where the staff were actually doing the paperwork to admit the
Right.
student over the counter.
Thank you, just curious.
Oh, I'm sorry, Adam.
Aaron, thank you for that great talk. Very informative as someone new to New York City, a great way to start understanding the system here. My reaction to the quandary you started with about trying to understand funding differences across schools with similar populations, and as we learned, similar teachers, similar levels of need among students. So you explained away some of the differences, but not all of it. And my reaction was, good. It's good that you can't explain away all of those differences because that means there's room for entrepreneurship. After all, what is leadership besides finding new ways to procure resources to serve your institution? And so effective principals are ones who manage to bring in more resources for their schools. Now, maybe I'm imagining a mechanism that has nothing to do with reality, and if so, I'm sure you'll set me straight. But I wouldn't want to be in a system where everything is determined purely by formula. After all, aren't different departments within a university funded at different levels? And doesn't that have to
Oh,
do...
no, never.
Doesn't that,
never.
yeah, doesn't it have to do with, the ability of the people who work there to be entrepreneurial and convince the system that an investment in my unit is going to pay off bigger for the system?
Well, I think one of the issues is whether, when we talk about garnering resources for schools, we're talking about garnering dollars that are an expansible pie, or just reallocating a fixed amount of dollars across schools. And it may well be that some school principals are much more effective. They're good at getting
Grant
grants.
funding was
Yeah.
one of the sources.
Yeah, they're good at getting grants. Now, if they're good at going out and getting grants that otherwise no one would get, that's great. But if they're good at getting grants that are at the expense of the school that's 3 miles away, that's not a good thing. So certainly cultivating an entrepreneurial spirit, and I think that there have been incentives in the system for school leaders to be entrepreneurial, is a good thing. But we do have to look at whether that's simply pitting principals against one another, or alternatively giving them the tools to go out and raise money that's not a zero-sum game.
I'd like to ask us all to give one more round of applause for Aaron.